Welcome to Women of Culture. I'm Meera T. Sundararajan. Join me and my distinguished guests to discover untold stories from the world of culture. I first met Gro Nesjar back in the summer of 2020, when a major controversy was going on in the city of Oslo, Norway. The controversy involved an artwork created by Gro's father, Carl Nesjar, in collaboration with Pablo Picasso. When Carl Nesjar was a young artist, he developed an original new method for sculpting in concrete called betograve, which fascinated the much older Picasso and gave him a new opportunity to express his creativity by transforming his drawings into monumental sculptures. Nesjar would later say, "I must be the only person in the world who has corrected a Picasso drawing." Two of these collaborative works became important works of public art when they were installed on the walls of a government building in central Oslo in the 1970s. However, the building was seriously damaged in a terrorist attack in Oslo in 2011. The Norwegian government decided to take these murals down, triggering a wave of protest from a public which felt that this was their art, that they hadn't been adequately consulted about the government's decision or the future of these works, and that taking the art down would, tragically, as many observers expressed it, accomplish something that the terrorist himself hadn't actually been able to do. Carl Nesjar was deeply disturbed about these plans, but he died in 2015. When the government finally started the process of dismantling the works, it was 2020, and Gro, along with the family of Erling Viksjø, the architect who designed the original building, decided to take a stand and sue the government in a desperate effort to pause the project until further consultations could be held. Unfortunately, Gro and Espen Viksjø could not pursue the case in court, and the artworks were ultimately taken down and put in storage until, the government says, they can be displayed according to its new plans. When this situation was first brought to my attention by two of my former students from Norway in 2020, I wrote and published a piece suggesting that Nesjar's moral rights as an artist under Norwegian law were in danger of being violated. In the course of my discussions with Gro, I came to know more about her and her father, the extraordinary artist Carl Nesjar, and about the Nesjar family's very special relationship with Picasso. I asked Gro whether she would be willing to talk to me about her experiences growing up with her father, her mother, and Picasso. I hope you'll enjoy our discussion as much as I did and agree with me that it's a fitting way to salute Picasso one more time as the year marking the 50th anniversary of the iconic artist's death draws to a close. Good evening, Gro, and thank you so much for your patience as we've sorted out our various technical issues, and finally we can start talking about the matters that are so interesting that have been waiting.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to have this opportunity. You are such a fascinating person, and you come from this very interesting background. So I look forward to hearing your perspectives. And I thought to begin with, if you don't mind, you could just say a few words of introduction about yourself.
Yeah, I grew up with parents being artists, both of them. My mother, a painter, quite well known in Scandinavia and Europe. She was actually the first female professor at the Royal Academy here in Norway.
Oh, extraordinary.
My father was, he did everything: photography, painting, watercolors, drawings, sculptures, water fountains, ice fountains, the whole thing. But what he's most famous for, of course, is his 17 co-work years with Picasso. So I grew up in that environment. I am an art historian. I used to run a fairly big company, international company, doing art consultancy, mostly for hotels, businesses, and the cruise industry.
Wonderful.
So that's me.
Fascinating, as I suspected, even more than I had realized. So thank you very much. And can you talk a little bit about how you've been involved with your father's legacy?
Yeah, my father and I were very close, and when he passed, he had problems at the end of his life because he couldn't hear very well and he didn't see very well, which for him, of course, was horrible because he was very much into music and, of course, being an artist. He when he passed away, we had a very difficult. What do you call it in English? Inheritance drama going around because of my stepmother and this and that. But he was always very clear that his legacy as an artist was to go to my brother, my half brother, and me. So we've been taken, or mostly I, because I'm the only one of us, the two of us living in Norway. And since this is where he originates, I have been taking care of everything. That includes selling his lithographs, getting all the rights for the reproductions, handling museums, wanting to borrowing photos, rights, all of that.
And so is most of your father's legacy then in Norway? Because I know he's done work all over the world. So do you find yourself dealing
with Well, that's an interesting question because I assume, to be honest, I don't really know, because I got a question from Barcelona because of the 50-year since Picasso passed away. They're doing, there's going to be lots of big exhibitions around the world, but there's also being one in Barcelona, since that's where they made the first sandblasted walls. And I asked Bono, which is the Norwegian what do you call it, not company, but the Norwegian handlers of that kind of things. And they haven't come back to me yet, because of course I want Barcelona to have the right to use my father photos all over the town, the city. But I don't know how that is going to be handled. But in order to answer your question, I would say that most of my father's legacy in that respect is in Norway. But so that's the first time it has something like that has come up.
That's very interesting, something like that coming up after a number of years. And I think Bono is the Artists' Rights Collective in Norway, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Right, who would help with the licensing issues. So I'll be very interested to hear how that develops.
Yeah, me too. I just wish they would come back to me. I'm sure they will. But I've said to Barcelona that, of course, we want them to use whatever they want to use of his photos. And for the show, there's going to be a lot of sketches and artwork that is like a joint venture between my father and Picasso. And I'm totally supportive of them using whatever they want to use. I just wanted to check how it's legally handled, and also how the payments are handled, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hear you saying several things that I find interesting, because it sounds like first of all, you said that you were very close to your father, and it sounds like you've had a very active role now in taking care of his legacy. And I find your attitude very interesting, because you say, well, I want to make it possible to use these things. I want to be able to authorize that. And so could you talk a little bit more about that? Because not every artist, as I'm sure you realize, is fortunate enough to have someone like you come after them in the family. And you also have the expertise to take a certain perspective on your father's work, and on your mother's for that matter. I actually shouldn't neglect to say that, right at the beginning, I couldn't help
but
thinking to
that's a
myself,
different matter, because my mother was mostly based in Norway, so
right,
and not on that level, to put
right.
it that way. But I think what I've always been thinking, the way I've been thinking, is that I want to try to do what I believe he would have done.
Absolutely.
And I know that he was a very, very open person, and he was open to basically everything, as long as it was good ideas. And I know that he would have loved having Barcelona city using his photographs on posters all over the city to mark the opening of this exhibition and during the duration of it. So that's been my philosophy all along, that the only thing I can do is to try to picture how he would have handled it himself.
Absolutely.
He wouldn't have bothered about the legality or or the money side of it anyway. But I feel I have to do that because of my children and because of my half brother.
Yes.
But the most important thing for me is that they will be able to do it.
Yes. And you sound very much like an artist's inheritor, like an artist's daughter, I think, when you say that.
Possibly.
Because many artists do prioritize the communication with the public, and they don't always think about the financial side, even while they may wish to take care of their families and so on. But there is
Absolutely.
but there is a creative impulse. I know a little bit about that myself, coming from a literary family, so I think the mentality is quite similar.
It's the same. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
of
But
course.
if we can turn then to another comment that you made, of course, about the relationship between your father and Pablo Picasso, which is something interesting for so many reasons. One factor that's striking to me is that they really came from different generations. And so, in that sense, it's perhaps not surprising that this has been an important part of your father's work and his fame, to be associated with this older artist whose work he helped to realize as well. So, could you talk a little bit about that and about your familiarity with Picasso?
Yeah, I think it's it's kind of a funny story, because we have in this country, we have, or had rather, we had a place or a company where where people could buy prints, lithographs,
Hmm.
for next to nothing, and it was like kind of the art out to the people movement.
Mm.
And my father was, of course, very supportive of that. And being, like I said, he was very open-minded. And I think that he thought that, why the hell not ask Picasso?
Hmm.
And everybody thought he was crazy, because I mean, at that point, this is I think it's about 60 or maybe even more years ago. So bringing up something like asking the world's most famous artist to do something for a tiny little country as Norway, and this was even before the oil, so nobody really knew what Norway was. They probably all thought it was part of Sweden or something. But anyway, so he set out to do that, because my father normally did that. When he decided to do something, he really tried. And
Right.
he went to France. He went to Cannes, trying to meet Picasso, which of course wasn't very easy.
I
And
can
then he
imagine.
almost gave up. So
Hmm.
the last evening before he was scheduled to come back again or go back to Paris, I don't know, he was at a
Yeah.
party that a very good friend of his threw on board his boat. And this friend was a former Kontiki crew member. So he was a
Okay.
sailor. And he met a guy called Fiddler, who was, I think, a ceramist, and he knew Picasso. So my father told him what he was set out to do. And Fiddler said, okay, let's go over to that phone booth in the harbor and we'll call him. And so they did.
Oh,
And Picasso
unbelievable.
said, yeah, why not come tomorrow? So my father went up there and met Picasso, and Picasso thought that was a brilliant idea. So he did a lithograph. I think it was 200x,
Okay.
um, and And then somebody said to my dad, I think that was Fiddler too, said, why don't you tell Picasso about the fact that you're working on this new technique called sandblasting? And so my father did. And Picasso went totally through the roof. He was because that kind of answered all his questions about how he could turn his work into three-dimensional big pieces. Because by then he had tried everything with the metal that he folded and all the and using paper, of course, which was his starting point. But this technique enabled him to do that, but in a huge scale. So that's how it all started.
That's amazing. That story
And then they
is absolutely
became
incredible.
quite good friends, close friends. And I think, like what you said, the generation gap between them, I think my father saw him as some sort of a father figure on one hand, but then as a very good friend. And he became good friend with Jacqueline. So they were very close, of course, up till Picasso's death. And Jacqueline and my dad stayed in touch up until her death.
So when you were growing up, was Picasso someone that you met, and did you know Jacqueline?
Yeah, we because he was living in Cannes, which was a very nice place to go, of course, for holidays and so on. And I think I was 3 or 4 the first times I met him, and then last time I met him, I was around 10, I think. So we went there quite frequently, and he also wanted to paint me, so he wanted me to come and stay with them, actually. But then my parents refused, which is really sad thinking of it now. But that was because we had been moving so much around, because we went from one place in Norway to Oslo, and then from Oslo to Paris, and then we kind of kept moving around. So I think they wanted to protect me from being moved again, because Picasso wanted me then to stay with them for a few months.
Right.
So yes, I met him quite often.
That's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how you saw him from your child's eye perspective?
Yes, yeah. Being 3 or 4, I think maybe 4, I had no clue who he was. Of course, to me, he was a very, very nice, very friendly, very open grandfather figure that I could play with, because he was very open to me. So we could go for walks in his garden. We could play with his dogs. He made masks for me to play with. We could draw together. So I think that's maybe why he also liked me so much, because he was surrounded with people who treated him like the emperor or a god. So to him, having somebody who was totally open but didn't really care about who he was probably a relief. I can, of course, remember that I when we came there the first time, and I saw he lived, of course, in a beautiful villa in La Californie. And he had a driver. He had I think it was a white Rolls Royce. He had a cook. He had somebody making his clothes that was sitting underneath the staircases, I seem to remember. I mean, all of that I hadn't seen before. So I was, of course, very kind of astonished or a bit surprised about that kind of life. And I couldn't really understand why everybody came with white, huge towels for him when we were at the beach, because nobody did that for my father. But apart from that, I didn't realize who he was at all. And for me, being in a studio with lots of canvases around, that I was used to, so I didn't find that very strange.
Yeah,
so I remember it as being very, very pleasant.
Amazing recollections, Gro.
Yeah, and I have lots of photographs with us together, and it's I think I liked him a lot, and I think he never made me feel insecure in any way, and he didn't demand any kind of respect. So I was very happy going to see him.
It's very interesting and also quite touching, actually, to hear your recollections, because here was this artist who, as you describe, was at the summit of his fame, and yet it seems like he had kept his inner child quite intact in a way.
Oh,
And
absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, and he could come out and be with you on those terms and just be a creative child again. So
Yeah.
it's quite
One
amazing.
of my father's favorite stories that he always told if he opened an exhibition that had to do with Picasso was one morning he came up to La Californie, or if it was in Mougins, I don't remember. But and Picasso was more tired than he used to. I mean, he didn't sleep very much, I think.
Right.
But he was then very tired. And my father asked, "So what have you been doing all night since you're so tired?" And he said, "I've been sitting up all night trying to copy my chauffeur's son's drawings, but I just can't do it." He just didn't, and he tried and he tried and he tried, but he said, I can't do it.
Extraordinary. Quite amazing to learn what kept him up all
Yeah,
night.
yeah, really, it really
Yeah,
is.
amazing. Well, I wanted to ask you specifically about some of those works created in collaboration between Picasso and your father, of course, and that was the context in which you and I first had the opportunity to meet a few years ago when we
Hmm.
were discussing the situation of these works in Oslo that were part of the government quarter there for a number of years, and finally, in this very sad incident, ended up getting damaged. And of course, there's been a whole range of events now that have followed on from that incident. So, would you be able to talk a little bit about this and share your perspective on what was happening with
Yes,
those works?
absolutely. I think the story started with this horrible terrorist attack
Yeah.
that damaged one of the government buildings, and for some odd reason, the government decided that since this had started, it's like the Picasso, the director of the Picasso Museum in Antibes put it in a speech. He said, "This is the first time the government is trying to fulfill what a terrorist started,"
Oh,
which is actually true, which makes it even worse in a way, because the building where these two Picassos, the collaboration work, which was one huge wall frieze or whatever you can call it, a sandblasted wall,
mm,
and another smaller inside sandblasted piece. That building was not damaged at all. There was another building that was damaged, but not seriously damaged. So actually, both of those buildings could have been kept exactly like they were. But I guess, I mean, that's kind of maybe beyond the point. But anyway, it was then decided that the Y block, which then was the one that had the fishermen on the outside wall, was to be taken down, and the other building was kept, which also had Picasso's inside. But so what they decided was to tear down the building and move these two wall pieces to a new building, which is still it's being constructed as we speak. And of course, again, trying to think how my father would have thought. And unfortunately, he was still around when this started.
mm,
And he couldn't believe it. I mean, at first he was interviewed, and he really couldn't believe what they were planning to do. And he said it's like tearing down the equivalent of the cathedral in Oslo, which was
mm,
maybe a bit exaggerated, but not really.
mm,
So he was totally in shock over this. And I had hoped, because this went back and forth, and it wasn't really, but it was approved before he passed. And I was hoping that nobody would tell him, because by then he was nearly deaf and nearly blind. So he wasn't reading newspapers and he wasn't listening to radio, obviously.
yeah.
So I thought, if he doesn't get to know this, that is the best that can happen, because I didn't want him to know. But then his wife told him, and he went almost into shock, which was so sad, because he could very happily, I mean, nothing would have changed anything for him. He just would have died a happier man, or a less unhappy man.
Yeah.
So that was that side of it. But anyway, then these pieces were then taken off the wall, which was an extremely complicated process, and they're now stored, and they're going to be put up in a totally different location, but within the government quarters. And I was just before we started talking, Mara, I went back just to kind of to remember how it was all decided and what really happened. But because one of the first things I think everybody reacted to, and also my father, was that these pieces were made specifically as a gift. The sketches were given to my father as a gift to the Norwegian people by Picasso. And they were to be accessible for everybody, of course. And the wall frieze, the biggest one, is a scene of fishermen, because that's how Picasso very rightfully pictured the Norwegians.
Right.
So that's one of the things that I think my dad was mostly upset about. Now it has been decided that it will be accessible to most people, because it will be above the VIP entrance to the Prime Minister's office. So it will be visible for people, but it will not be as visible as it was, unfortunately.
Yeah, so actually quite a dramatic change of context in that sense has happened, or will.
Yeah, and not only that, because this was the reason how all of this started was that my godfather, Erling Viksjø, who was probably one of Norway's foremost architects at that time, was the one who made the government, at that time, the government center. And he was the one who very much wanted a Picasso. And he and my father were very, very close. So that's how, and he was also the one who developed this unique technique that enabled them to reproduce, call it that, or recreate the sketches on a huge scale. And so when it first came up that they should be moved, I think the worst part was, first of all, relocating site-specific art is not something one should do at all. I mean, it should be forbidden. But
Yes.
but also making it less accessible when it is a gift from the world's most famous artist to a nation is not very good.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you mentioned as well that I just wanted to ask you about is, right now the works are in storage. So what is the situation with that?
Well, I think I haven't even gone there because it's too upsetting for me, I think. I think they're in a storage which makes them visible if you know about it or if you really search it out. But it's not something, because the important thing is to remember that these were placed on a building, on a wall, that was accessible for everybody, not only the ones that had anything to do in the government quarters. It was on the outer wall, so you could see it from one of the main streets in Oslo. You could see it from lots of office buildings, and it was a place where people used to walk. You know, so it was where they're placing it now. You have to either want to see them, or you have to be invited into a government or have anything to do there, something to do there, which is very different.
Yeah, that's a very different setting, and that's a very different public that ultimately has access to the work.
Yes.
So that makes perfect sense what you're saying. When the discussion about what to do with the works was happening, I know that you took various steps. Would you be willing, if it's not too upsetting, to revisit it, especially?
Oh yeah, no, of course. Yeah, I mean, we tried to or it ended up in court, and of course we lost. We could have taken it further, but I think both for Erling Viksjø's son, no, grandson, who is also a friend of mine, and myself, it became too upsetting and also very expensive, because trying to sue a government for moving something that you're against moving is not an easy. I mean, I think if we had felt that we had more support, also maybe financial support, we would have proceeded. But I think the feeling was that we could have taken it all the way and we would have lost, because we were fighting the Norwegian government. So
Yeah.
that's why we kind of decided to draw back.
Yes, and I think your decision makes perfect sense. And I'm glad that you mentioned these points because a lot of people don't realize how difficult it actually is in practice for artists and those responsible for the works of artists to protest when these kinds of situations arise. And,
Mm,
it is very distressing, as you said, perfectly, not only emotionally distressing, but then this whole issue of the cost and the risk associated with going
mm,
through this process. And, my own view on this is that these are risks that we shouldn't be asking the artist to shoulder in situations like
no,
this.
no.
And especially in the case of these kinds of works where there's such a strong public interest involved and so much symbolism from the public point of view.
Mm.
I can't help but really criticize, to be honest, the way that all of this was dealt with on the part
Yeah,
of the
and
government. Yeah.
I think another aspect of that is that Norway is not exactly, put it that way. I don't think this would have happened in France or Italy. Because Norwegian, I mean, we're a tiny country. We're not very much into culture and art, and I think it's more. It seems more important to Norwegians to save fishing boats or to save, whatever, than to save pieces of art. And that's of course very, very sad because we're a fairly young nation and we don't have very much. I don't think we don't feel that we need to protect things like this, and that makes it even worse in a way.
Yeah, exactly, because it's the process then of building up a sense of national heritage and pride in our
Mm,
heritage that's effectively being undercut when it's still in its very early stages.
mm, mm.
I mean, I did, just looking in upon that story, I did find it interesting that it seemed like there was quite a big public outcry about what was happening there.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
maybe your comment is a bit poignant though, because there are people clearly in Norway, just like everywhere, who are aware of these issues, but then the decision makers aren't necessarily in a position to, or feel that they're in a position to do
No,
anything dramatic. So,
no, and there isn't enough people. I think if this had happened in Paris, for instance, or in Rome, it would have been totally different. And maybe even in Sweden.
yeah,
But that's just the way it is. But I mean, we're learning, and I'm sure we'll we'll get there eventually. But at that point, when this happened, there was very little we could do.
I mean, you've commented on this a little bit, but do you think there's anything more that you noticed or that you could say about why the government ended up taking the particular direction it did? Because that was something that wasn't necessarily clear to me. It sort of seemed like there was a bit of a gap between
Yeah.
the government's plans and the public interest, and it just seemed like the
Yes.
communication wasn't happening.
Yeah, it was, and there was. I mean, there was lots of information that came up during the process, which was kind of, I don't know. I think there was a lot of information that the public didn't get, and I think the government used a lot of excuses for going through with something that they hadn't needed to do, because one of the I mean, that's just technical, but there was a tunnel going underneath this building, the Y block,
Okay.
and they said that this could be a new terror goal, because if you did something in that tunnel, you would of course damage the whole area. But that was really far fetched. I mean, it would be like moving the parliament in London because it was too close to the Thames. It's
Right.
almost to that level,
Wow.
because they could have closed the tunnel, or they could have, and I mean, really, it wasn't a terrorist attack goal anyway. So I think all of this was used. Somebody probably wanted to create a new government building, and they needed more space and more buildings. And afterwards, a lot of criticism has also come up, that why are they putting everything in one area instead of spreading it like most countries do? not having all the departments within the government in the same area. So, I mean, there's lots of things that came up later that showed that they could very well have avoided taking down the Picassos.
Right. Right. And can I ask you about that? I mean, it's speculative, so maybe not the easiest exercise, but suppose you could go back and revisit this situation. What do you think an ideal outcome would have been?
Or to not do anything, because they wouldn't have needed to do anything.
Right.
They could have left the building as it was, with the Picasso outside and the seagull Picasso inside, and just left it. And they could have developed the backside of the area and made it bigger, like they're doing anyway. So the building wouldn't have, because where the building was, it's now going to be a park. So it's obvious that that building could have been there. And back to the tunnel thing, even then the park would have been damaged. The whole thing was very, very strange. But I mean, that's things like that happens all the time.
Yes.
It's just it doesn't normally involve artwork on that level.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess the solution that you're proposing then, from your point of view, would that have succeeded in preserving the context and the inherent meaning
Yes.
of the work?
Yes, absolutely, because they haven't changed the whole thing with people being able. And actually, when we started talking, when we started this case, we suggested that, okay, if they had to take down the building, if that was something that one really wanted to do, you could take the Picasso, the main wall, and you could leave it in the park as a freestanding piece in the park, more or less in the same position it was, but without the building. Right. And that would have been perfectly doable, and it would have been much more accessible for people, because then this is a public park, which is kind of a little bit outside or around the government quarters. Yeah. So that would have been, and then you would have had the thing which was so lovely about it, that people saw it from everywhere. So that was a sad part.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole idea of works of art that are so valuable being prioritized for the public, being prioritized for public access. I mean, it's something really visionary that you're describing. And
yeah, and I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that this was something that was part of a building. It was actually the wall. So it is really like, I think my father put it a bit bad when he said it's like tearing down that church, but it's like, I don't know, it's like taking the tower off something, because you don't want to have a tower there anymore. But it was actually part of the building, you know?
Yeah, or I guess conversely, in that sense, the building was part of the work.
Yeah, exactly. And when Picasso did the sketches, he had that building. He met with the architect. He had an ongoing dialogue with Erling Viksjø, the architect, and that was the whole basis for him to do this. You know, so it's like you don't tear down a building that has an utter wall made by Picasso.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that I must say, although I was very sympathetic to your perspective in all of this, I didn't fully grasp the importance or the significance of removing it until I was actually speaking with Monsieur Andral of the museum, Picasso Museum at Antibes, where he said, well, wait a minute, Mira, because I was very focused on the idea of physical preservation of these works. And, you know, that was a concern too, that when you talk about dismounting something that's...
Yes, of course, of course.
And so I was really focused on that. But then Jean-Louis said to me, well, wait a minute, Mira, that's not the main thing. That's not the only thing here. There's actually something a lot deeper than that that's involved, you know, having to do with the very nature of the work itself and the place, the setting being an integral part of what it is. So whether we're speaking about it from a public interest point of view, but then you're bringing up this question of artistic integrity, and of course, your father's perspective as one of the creators of that work. That clearly there's something really fundamental at stake when it comes to artistic integrity that we can't ignore.
Yeah, which made the Picasso administration's point of view extremely strange.
Would you
because
like to
they
say a little
approved
about
it.
that?
Yeah, because I think that was one of the most. I mean, when we had kind of started to get used to what the Norwegians really wanted to do, and that they were going to go ahead doing this, the second most surprising thing was that it was actually supported by the Picasso administration. And I think that, I mean, it's almost like you think they must have been fooled, because there's no reason whatsoever that they should have had to accept that. From my point of view, I can't understand how they could have been tricked or whatever, how they did this. But because I think they very easily, but you know much more about that, Myra, than I do. But I assume that if they had said no, then it would have been very difficult to go ahead doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're looking at a situation where 3 creators were involved in this project, and one of them, Picasso, was a very established artist, a very senior artist. And so both in your father's case and in Mr. Viksha's case, you joined forces, but the Picasso representatives were the odd ones out, in a sense, in this discussion. And unfortunately, there could be so many reasons why that was the case, but I do think that that was a really serious obstacle to the presentation of a unified position that the government might have had to reckon with in a study.
Absolutely, that would have made all the difference.
Yeah, given the collaborative nature of the work. I mean, it's a shame that there wasn't an understanding that could be.
Yeah, and also the fact that we had never had to kind of try or to look at who really had the rights.
Yeah.
If you look at my father, looking at the collaboration.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it was very complex.
Yeah. How does if you can comment on that, how does the Picasso administration then see these collaborative works? Is there some sort of overarching perspective that they have?
That's a very good question, and to be honest, I don't really know, because it seems like on one hand that this is something that they would, in a way, want to forget or not mention very much, because I just read that Maya's daughter is now writing a book or a catalogue raisonné about his sculptural work or his 3-dimensional work.
Yes.
And as far as I know, these are not included, which is really strange, because I think it's 30 pieces worldwide, and we're talking seriously worldwide. And they're important pieces. I mean, they're landmark pieces. So I think it's very strange that they have taken. And I guess we could guess why they're doing it, but I don't know. I just find it very, very strange.
As an art historian, is it something that concerns you as well? Because I imagine that authenticating artworks and establishing a sort of accurate narrative of art history is something that is quite important from that point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, on one hand, and on the other hand, it's also very important because it becomes a personal issue, because it has to do with my father, and I know that these pieces would not have existed without him.
Of course.
And like it said in his obituary in the New York Times, it said he was the only artist to ever corrected a drawing by Picasso, which is probably true. Or
Absolutely.
not probably, I mean, it is true.
Yeah.
And so it's very sad that these fantastic pieces, I'm not saying that they're neglected, but I'm saying that I think it's strange that because this represents one side of Picasso, which is important as far as I can see
Yeah.
to the world. And so it's a bit strange that they're not kind of, doesn't seem like they're in the administration's focus, put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think fortunately from the public point of view, you are there to spread the word in terms of what you know and your connection with your father. So we're not relying, only on the Picasso administration, but that's,
No, 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 no. And I mean, there are books that has been published
yeah, of
about
course.
these pieces, and of course, it's been a lot of focus from the Norwegian side and Norwegian art historians and so on.
Yeah.
But I think the way they're handling it is a bit odd, especially because I believe that that could have saved these specific pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. Save them in context, as you say.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
in
and
the right
arrived at a
context.
yeah, and arrived at a solution that satisfied the public interest that came up,
Mm.
which was
Which was the whole point initially.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, now that we're speaking a little bit about Picasso and the Picasso administration, maybe I can bring up a couple of other issues because, of course, this is a very important year for Picasso's legacy. It's been 50 years since he died, and there's been a huge interest taken by people and organizations in celebrating that anniversary or commemorating it.
Mm.
But it's also happening at a very interesting political moment when a lot of social values are being re-examined all over the world. And so I have come across quite a bit of controversy surrounding Picasso that seems to be in the forefront of a lot of these discussions, about his treatment of the women in his life. And
Mm.
also some pieces about the influence of African art on his artistic
Mm.
vision and why that
Mm.
isn't a more popular subject of discussion among scholars and better known among the public and so on. So you have both the personal and the professional angle on some of these questions. So are you able to comment?
I think on the African art, I'm not. I wasn't. I was actually wasn't aware of that, but of course that's
Mm,
true. Um, but I guess that is an art historical point of view, and looking
yeah.
at his the way he the his the way he expressed himself, and that the cubism has so much to do with the African way of expressing themselves, and the connection with the masks and all of that. But when it comes to his way of treating women, um, I don't know.
Mm,
I think that that's also a very difficult thing to comment on because, I mean, he died 50 years ago. 50 years is quite a long time,
yeah.
and a lot of things has changed, of course, to the better when it comes
Mhm.
to women's rights.
Yeah.
But I think he it's another kind of funny story because once we were there, my mother was with us, and Picasso looked at my mother with his almost black eyes,
Mm,
and he said, "How do you find it possible at all being a mother, a woman, and an artist?"
mm,
And I think in many ways, maybe that explains his way of treating women. Not that he had to be rude or whatever, but I think he was so much an artist that for him everything else was just like props in a way,
mm,
you know.
mm,
And I think that was just the way he functioned. And I think he probably had to function that way in order to do what he did.
mm.
And of course, that's a very maybe many women or people in general will find that a very horrible thing to say, but I think it one has to kind of look a bit behind and see why was it that he maybe behaved in those ways. And I think it was in order to protect or to be able to do what he did.
How did your mother react to the question, may I ask?
She she in a way, I think she, first of all, she probably was a bit shocked, She wasn't very easily shocked, actually. But when she told me this story, she said he was absolutely right. It's just that nobody understands it. So she
Yeah.
totally agreed. She said, it isn't possible, really, but you have to do it. Being a woman and being a mother, you have to do it. But like she said, it isn't possible. So she totally agreed.
Yeah, actually,
And
the
up till she passed, she agreed. I mean, we could have these discussions, and she said, "No, it's not possible because if you're a true artist and you're really into what you're doing, that absorbs every inch of you, every cell of you,
Mm,
and it has to."
mm,
I mean, that doesn't allow you to not be nice to other people, but
mm,
but uh, but I can understand. I mean, I'm not an artist, but I grew up with lots of them, and
mm,
and 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 I think I can grasp a bit of what she or and he was actually trying to say.
mm. Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying, and I think it's a very difficult issue because there are so many unknowns, and
Yeah,
there's so much social pressure of various kinds that all of the people involved in these equations feel, but that artists
yeah,
feel.
and
So
I
it's
think
just yes, go ahead.
I think maybe we, as a society, we have decided that everybody should behave a certain way, which of course is good, absolutely.
Mm,
But I think maybe 50 years ago, 80 years ago, that wasn't exactly the same thing. I saw yesterday, last night, I saw a very interesting old movie about the life of T.H. Lawrence,
oh,
and looking at that, you see how, I mean, he was a genius in his own eyes, and he
yeah,
was a very good writer. I mean, no
yeah,
question about it. But that allowed him at that time to behave more or less the way he wanted. And as it did with Picasso, as it probably did with a lot of artists.
mm,
I think the difference with my mother was that she was a woman. So that was a bit more complicated and
mm,
probably still is.
mm,
But I mean, that's the way it is. But I don't know if that answers your question. But
mm,
I think that's where it lies. It's not that he
mm,
wanted to be difficult or rough or whatever or with women. I think it was just that his focus wasn't on that. His focus was on what he was doing.
mm. Yeah, it's a very thought-provoking answer, and as I said, I don't really think that there is some kind of clear answer to these questions. You know, Picasso was a very important and influential artist, and he had
Mm,
a very complicated personal life.
mm. They all
You
do.
know, yeah, exactly in their own ways. And I think your mother's reaction is really interesting to me too, because just thinking about the social context in which women have lived and
Mm,
tried to be creative individuals. I mean, you know, there's no reason to think that women are any less inherently creative than men, but they
no,
have, you know,
no,
in the past.
absolutely not.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
exactly, but they've lived in very repressive environments
Mm,
in the past, and that just has a huge impact. So
mm,
I definitely understand your mother's reaction. Um, it's this has been a very interesting time for me because I've been doing a lot of work on my great grandfather, who was the national poet of India, and he was a
mm.
very strong proponent of women's rights and had a very different perspective on many of these matters. He actually wrote, "Where women comes art. Where women
Yeah.
comes
Yeah.
art," which is a
Oh, that's
quite
fantastic.
yeah quite a different perspective than what we
Yes.
usually come
Yes.
across. But you know, in his case, he had a family, he had a wife and two daughters, but then
Yeah.
their family life was highly unusual because the wife and two daughters became sort of the living exemplars of all of his social ideas, and everything in the
Yeah.
house
Yeah.
had to be run according to those social
Yeah.
ideas, and the women
Yeah.
had to behave as free women in a society that was very unfree for women.
Yeah.
So it was a great challenge, but
Yeah. So
luckily
in a
I
way, it's the
mm,
same. It's just the flip.
it's
It's
the
just the
flip
other
side
side.
almost
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
fortunately there was an alchemy there. My great grandmother was the right person for that. She was cut out for that life.
Mm,
And his daughters also rose to the occasion, and so that's been our family legacy. But it's it's very difficult, and the people in my
mm,
family made a lot of sacrifices, including
mm-hmm,
him, of course.
mm,
So I'm always fascinated by this question of how artists behave, what they need,
mm,
whether male or female.
mm.
How do they see the other gender, especially? How do the males see
Yeah.
the females? And my great grandfather provides a great model, but
Yeah.
it's a very different cultural
Yeah.
context.
That's very interesting. But
Yeah,
I think also a lot of female artists has chosen to not have children or to
yeah,
not have a family.
yeah.
And I guess in many ways that's exactly what Picasso meant when he said that to my
Yes,
mother.
yes,
How could you try to choose both?
yeah. And there's, historically speaking, for sure, I mean, going back 50 years, I think there's a degree
Mm,
of social realism. It shouldn't be the case, but I think it was.
no, it
Yeah.
was absolutely, absolutely, and I think in many ways it still is. But of course,
Mm.
uh, thank God it's moving forward. But I think but I mean that's a totally different discussion because
Yeah.
there's a price for everything. You know,
Yeah.
everything comes as at a price.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think we need to have a separate discussion about your mother as well,
Yes.
as I said at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a totally different discussion.
And I look forward
Absolutely.
to it very much.
Me
Um,
too.
but for tonight, perhaps just turning back to our discussion of your father and Picasso and their fascinating relationship, I have to ask you, more generally about the legacies of artists like them, and what are your thoughts on how those legacies should be preserved?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question because
Mm,
it's. I mean, my father's legacy is one thing. Picasso's legacy is something totally different. Renoir's is. I mean, it's on different levels.
mm,
But I think I just have to answer that personally from my point of view, which
sure.
is that the only way I can try to deal with or try to make the right decisions in how to handle his legacy is to try to think, like I said, what would he have done himself?
Mm,
What
absolutely.
would he have thought? But when it comes to Picasso, I have to say that I mean, I read the article from Art Review. I guess it's maybe 10 years old, but
Mm,
it's very interesting to read how the Picasso family has decided or has gone about um, dealing with theirs. And I think maybe uh, I don't know. I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions about that I would like to ask. I think it's a bit strange because uh, it's such an enormous inheritance or legacy to handle, and I think maybe they've handled it in a strange way. Yeah.
mm. If you feel comfortable commenting about that, I'd love to hear more, or if you'd rather speak more,
Yeah,
because you
no,
say,
I
yeah,
think I think just reading a bit about it, I think it's interesting, and I mean that's not very strange that a family with that
mm,
many children from different mothers,
yeah,
that of course it ended up being two different ways of thinking about it, with Claude on one end and Maya at the other end,
mm-hmm,
and it seems like they weren't exactly communicating very well.
mm,
And that's not very strange because that probably happens in all families.
right,
It doesn't have to do with art, but I think the way they've decided to handle it, where they don't really have, I mean, they have a legal uh, help as far as I know. They have an attorney who is part of the Picasso administration,
yeah, that's
but
right.
it doesn't seem like they have anybody who's really from the art historical point of view, and I
Mm,
think that's really strange
mm,
because it seems like this is like a family reunion type of thing that decides everything, and it must be one of the world's biggest. Well, I think it is actually because there was so much art. I mean, he was so productive.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like a group of people are handling something that maybe, I don't know. It's difficult to say, but it seems like it could have been maybe handled in a much more professional way, put it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, are works still being discovered today from Picasso? Because as you say, he lived for such a long time and he was creative
I
for
think
some
so.
time. Hmm.
I think so. And I think I read somewhere that he was. I think he was the most productive artist that we know of.
Hmm.
So of course there's enormous amounts of paintings, drawings, sculptures, everything around, and it must be a very, very difficult workload to handle, I would assume.
Absolutely. And I suppose, at the risk of asking something obvious, I suppose an authentication process is then important for a lot of these works that are appearing.
Absolutely, and I have some personal experience from that too, because I was left not a load, but I mean quite a few things, and I've sold some of it, and the big international auction houses, they have a process in place that they have to follow,
Mm-hmm.
which also then makes it a bit questionable how why the family or the administration choose to handle it the way they do, I think.
Absolutely.
If you turn it
Absolutely.
around and you think about it as a company, as a corporation, it would have been handled totally differently. Not that that's comparable, but in a way it becomes a bit comparable because he died 50 years ago. I mean, this all kind of it's starting it dates back.
Yeah.
And it's I find it very. I'm just wondering, what are they going to do in, let's say, in 20 years? What will then be the status? Will it then be the grandchild who handles it? You know, it's kind of, it opens up to a lot of kind of questions about how is this really done in the right way. But then again, that's we're not here to judge that anyway.
Mhm.
But we
Yeah.
can question it.
Yes, and I think it's important that the questions be asked because just as you're saying, we're talking about the future. And
Mm,
for another 20 years, there's still a copyright in force, as far as I'm aware. But then after that, it becomes open to the public in a
yeah.
new way.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
we're still
yeah. But
relying
that
on,
doesn't really change anything about the authentication
yes, I was
process.
just, you took the word right out of my mouth. Yeah.
Okay,
We're still
sorry.
relying on that. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I think it's yeah. I think it's a bit. It becomes really questionable if you think about it in the respect that, okay, it will be the grandchild,
Yes.
and on what grounds? Kind of with what background?
Yeah, it's a great challenge because we're moving further and further away from the actual experience of that person, the lived experience of the artist.
Yes,
Tonight we're
yes.
talking, and I'm so privileged to be able to hear you talk about your personal recollections of Picasso. In another 50 years, that's not going to be possible.
No,
And
no, and I mean, I assume that that's the basis of it's a it's a droit moral, and
yes.
it's that of course is based on the fact that one assumes that being a child, in my case, I think I would have felt or seen, but mostly felt if something wasn't made by my dad, if I was asked, and if it was a forgery, and I assume that's kind of a little bit the basis on why this is the way it is.
Yeah.
But then in 20 years that doesn't exist anymore. So
Well, I mean,
it's very strange. And then when you talk about Picasso,
hmm,
again being the most productive artist and with prices of over $100 million,
yeah.
it's an enormous thing to handle.
Yeah. And I mean that raises a whole other question about what's happening in the art market. And I
Yeah.
would be curious to hear your thoughts on that briefly, because obviously your father's works are out there and Picasso's works are out there, and the market is a driving force in a lot of ways. So What?
Yeah, that's totally beyond comparison.
Yeah.
Just to mention that, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, I don't know what you can say about it. It seems like, which is, I think, the interesting side of that is that has nothing to do with them, but it has to do with art in general. And it seems like, I mean, that we know from history that art is the only thing apart from gold that always keeps its value, regardless of what. I mean, we saw what was going on under World War II, and we see what's happening now.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing that doesn't go down now, price wise, is art.
Absolutely.
And the market is living and thriving, and it's fine. Everybody else is depressed, afraid, worried, but the art market is doing great. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I
Probably
think
not. It
it's
was a bit sidestepping it.
no, that was very interesting. I think it's a bit of an unanswerable question. Again, so much of what we've been discussing has been about artists' attitudes towards their work and towards the public and the public interest. So I think when you bring in the question of the art market and the prices of some of these works, notably by Picasso and other certain very popular artists, and what are the implications of those works passing into private ownership at these prices? I think it's a very troubling area. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I can
as you
see
say,
why.
it's
Yeah,
yeah. But as you say, it's a large. I mean, it's a huge, vast operation. So it's very
yes,
hard to. Yeah, it's very
yeah.
hard to say.
But I mean, if I don't know if what you're trying to say is that, of course, it's sad in one way that private collectors buy up. But I think in Picasso's case, it's not that sad because there is such an enormous amount of Picasso art out there anyway, and in museums and rightly placed. So
Yeah.
I mean, if private collectors also collect them, that's absolutely fine in that case. But in many other artists' case, that's not fine.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very helpful perspective. I never quite thought of a thing as being a surfeit of works by Picasso, but I sort of see what you mean by that
Yeah, no,
suggestion.
but I mean, I think the museums they have collected what's. I think the museums have been able to buy what they would. I mean, probably there is a lot of pieces they would have liked to have where they lost auctions because private buyers ended up buying it. But I think in his case, it's not a big problem, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to conclude, I just want to ask you one more question, which is just about what you were saying a few moments ago, actually, and what you've said several times in the course of our conversation about putting yourself in the position of thinking, what would your father want? How would he see this? And I just find that such an interesting exercise. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you do that, if that question makes sense. How does one do that? And that's something that we confront in our family as well, trying to know what my great grandfather would
Yeah,
have wanted. How do we
yeah.
go about doing that, and how do we get a satisfactory outcome?
Yeah, but I think it's more complicated for you guys because you have to go 3 generations back. I have a very vivid memory and a very strong feeling of how or what my father was. Uh, and I think I knew him, being close to him, I knew him so well that I think I know how he would have, I think I do, reacted to different things. But uh, and I think that's the only. I don't know, but I think a lot of people, or maybe a lot of people in my situation, would have thought that I will do whatever it takes, or I will take any point of view as long as it makes me more money. Um, and which is very sad. I mean, not to say that I'm not interested in money. Absolutely. I mean, of course, but it's I'm trying. I'm not saying that I'm succeeding, but I'm trying to put myself in his shoes and think, how would he have reacted? What would he have liked to do now? And being in Norway, and again a small country, he did a lot of public sculptures on his own. This ice fountains, different kind of public work, and a lot of, I mean, it happens maybe 2-3 times a year actually, that something comes up. Either a sculpture needs to be moved, which has happened twice this year, or the sculpture piece is being damaged or it needs repair. And then how do you handle this? And again, you just have to try to think what would he have done, and how can you make this even more or accessible for everybody, because that was his philosophy, and I guess that's all artists' philosophy.
Yes,
they want to be accessible. I mean, that's why they work.
yeah. No, that's very inspiring, and it seems like you have really met the challenge of trying to see your father as a whole person, which I think is a great challenge for any child at any age, actually, is to see our parents in a more holistic light. And you see him as your father, you see him as an artist, and you're able to bring those images together to try to step into his shoes, as you say. And I think.
But again, he managed to be a good father and being an artist, even though I missed him and it disappeared and all of that. But he was still mine when he was there, and I guess that's why I try to do it as best as I can. But when I'm looking at my mother, which is a totally different case in many ways, because she was the one I lived with, because they got divorced when I was 7, I think. Uh, I always try to do the same thing for her, but I can see the difference between, or how difficult it really was to be kind of a mother on one side and then an artist on the other.
Yeah, very interesting. You've seen two different perspectives, but I think that it's been incredibly informative for me to hear you talk about your relationships with both your mother and father, and of course with Picasso. And it's really exciting that there is someone like you to be part of taking all of these legacies forward. Your father's as well as your mother's in its own way, and the part that you've played in Picasso's legacy as well, whatever the Picasso administration or anyone else may have to say about that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we conclude?
No, I think this was very interesting and very, very good. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gro. This has been just absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to share this conversation in some form with other listeners.